organization that is dedicated to engaging with systems change to create a just and regenerative future. So very grateful to have Sally here today talking about what a just and regenerative future looks like. And I'm also delighted to have Lance Gould here with us today, whom I've had the pleasure of knowing for over a decade, since my time at the World Economic Forum when you were the executive editor of the Huffington Post, working very closely with Arianna Huffington herself. And Lance is now the CEO of Brooklyn Story Lab. And so Lance will be engaging in conversation with Sally, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you both have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sally, for being here. Thank you so much for the introduction, Noah. And it is a pleasure to kick off the second day of the Inclusive Impact Summit, hosted by the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation. As Noah said, my name is Lance Gould, and I'm the CEO of Brooklyn Story Lab, which is a media consulting firm that helps purpose-driven organizations better tell and amplify their stories. I'm a former journalist of about 30 years, and as Noah mentioned, I was an executive editor at Huffington Post before launching Brooklyn Story Lab. And Sally, it is so wonderful to be with you here today. And I'm excited to discuss the idea of a JNR, that is a just and regenerative mindset. To start us off, I believe you're going to take us through a brief slide presentation to give us a little introduction to and context for what is meant by just and regenerative. And then we'll have a dialogue of a few questions on the subject. And then we'll save time for questions from the audience. So audience, please write your questions in the chat. And Sally, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I'm just going to start to share my screen then. 1 second. Here we go. So thank you very much for the invitation to join today. Let me go into slideshow so you can see my full screen. I'm actually joining from a side room at the Tate Modern, just by the River Thames. So I've just given a talk in real life to an auditorium of 200 people. It's so exciting. I'm now in some really weird back room. So apologies if the sound isn't great and you might hear teacups rattling because the cafe is just there, but hopefully we'll be okay. So yeah, I just had a few slides to really start to get us to think about what we mean by just and regenerative, and very much looking forward to the conversation. Just a little bit about Forum, and thank you, Noah, for that introduction. We are a 501c3 in the US, registered charity here in the UK, same status in Singapore and Mumbai. We're quite small, we're 80 people across those 4 offices, but actually we have a very big ambition, and that is to contribute to really playing a role in shifting the systems around us. And Noah is one of our trustees, so really delighted, Noah, that you are part of our board, and thank you again for your continued support. So that's just a little bit about Forum. We work in individual partnerships, developing ambitious transformational strategies. And then we also have a number of pre-competitive collaborations really focused on those barriers to a just and regenerative future. So why just and regenerative? I think for me, this slide kind of summarizes why just and regenerative and why now. And if I were to put it in my own words, and this is what I've just been talking about here at the Tate, we're at the edge of the capacity of our current systems to sustain us. Our current systems, they're fragile, they're brittle, they're volatile. And we also hear alongside that, the food system is broken, the health system is broken, the economy is broken. From a systems point of view, these systems are not broken. They are working really well to the current goals of those systems, which if we take food, by and large, some exceptions, the goal of the food system is cheap food produced in ways that doesn't take account of planetary boundaries, doesn't take account of biodiversity, cheap food coming to market that's not necessarily nutritious and isn't accessible to all. So the goals of the food system are quite extractive, and the food system is working pretty well to those goals. Think about the health system. The goal of the current health system here in the UK and Europe, in the US, is to treat people when they get sick. What happens if you change the goals of the health system to keeping people well? And so we have an opportunity at this moment in time, as all of the systems around us are in dynamism, are in flux, particularly driven by the shock of COVID and the ongoing shocks to the system. we have an opportunity to reconfigure these systems and to change the goals of the system and to drive what I would call deep transformation, as opposed to a shallow transition. So that's the risk at the moment. Yes, we could see a transition in energy, but it could be a shallow transition. It might not work for everybody. You might not have social equity centered at its heart. So why just and regenerative is because why not? And also absolutely right now, because if we can begin to think of just and regenerative now, then we can begin to reconfigure the very systems that we rely on. And just again, to put the concept of just and regenerative into a broader perspective. So we have the dynamism, the fragility of the systems around us right now. We've also got this evolution of corporate sustainability. So we've been on a journey when we think about corporate sustainability, starting from version 1.0, minimizing negative impacts, doing less harm. This was what, 20 years ago? Then about a decade ago, we started to see organizations saying, actually, we need to be neutral, carbon neutrality, waste neutrality, water neutrality. And then I got really excited and I helped draft these guidelines for net positive, recognizing that we can't just be slightly less bad. We need to understand, how do we put more back into society, more back in the economy than we take out? And net positive was launched into the world about, I don't know, 8 years ago now. And I did think this was pretty ambitious. Really, if we put more back into environment and society than we take out, surely that will deal with some of these big trends from climate emergency through to structural inequality. Well, yes and no. This is a phrase that I used to use an awful lot, and it really came into circulation after the financial crash of 2008. For those of you old enough to remember that, this was the point in time when across the world, banks were being bailed out by government. And there was a plea from some of us in the sustainability movement to say, well, just imagine if nature was a bank, we would have bailed it out a long time ago, because we've been running down the value of ecosystem assets. And then it really occurred to me 2 years ago, actually, it was a very sort of pandemic aha moment. In the middle of the pandemic, it just really occurred to me that actually, unless you reconfigure the underlying systems, then you'll always need a bailout. So at its simplest, if you think about a bucket with a hole in it and you're filling it with water, you're going to keep needing to fill it with water unless you really put something at the bottom of the bucket and fix that hole. And so unless we fix our systems and reconfigure them, we'll always need a bailout. And so that's why I am so excited about this notion of regenerative outcomes, this notion of just and regenerative, because for me, this speaks to the absolute necessity for businesses, for government, for philanthropy to think about how do they reconfigure the living systems, social systems, education as a social system, and environmental systems, climate, ocean. How do we reconfigure these systems so that they create the conditions in which people and planet can thrive into the long term, and we shift from these brittle, volatile systems that are at the limits of sustaining us into even the short term. So that's the kind of why of just a regenerative business. Then onto the what. We published something in November last year called the Business Transformation Compass. It's on our website. Just Google Forum for the Future Business Transformation Compass. It's quite a deep read. There's a lot in there. But what we try and do is define what we mean by just and regenerative. So we've set out this guiding star vision of just and regenerative. And we talk about a just and regenerative approach being an approach where you're trying to pursue a future where social and environmental systems allow people to thrive. We've rapidly stabilized planetary health. We're currently on a trajectory for around a 3.5 degrees centigrade rise by the end of this century. That is not going to be sustainable by anybody's imagination. What we've also done within the Business Transformation Compass and within our defining of just and regenerative is we've tried to elevate the social dimension of sustainability. If you think about ESG, the S in ESG has really been neglected over the last few years. And so we're really trying to elevate the S in this conversation. So we talk about human rights being universally accepted and critically fairer ways to create value and to distribute value. I'm still struck by statistics such as the ones by 2030, 2/3 of the world's wealth will be held by 1% of the population. That isn't sustainable by any stretch of the imagination. So how do we think about fairer ways of creating value, fairer ways of distributing value? And then the final attribute of this just and regenerative approach really starts with where sustainable development began. So over 50 years ago, when Harlan Brundtland defined sustainable development, she talked about intergenerational equity, handing over the planet, its structures, in a way that you want people to really ensure that their long-term sustainability is front and center, handing over a world that we want the next generation to look after. We've done a pretty terrible job of that. And so a just and regenerative future is where we're not only serious, I mean, properly serious about intergenerational equity, but we're also serious about resilience across geographies. We live in a very, very unequal world. And so how then do we get to this notion of just and regenerative? I won't go into huge detail here. These are some macroeconomic shifts that we need to see, from thinking about the economy as purely being profit maximization. The economy isn't broken. This is its primary goal. We need to broaden out that goal. So it's about environmental and societal value creation. We also need to price in those externalities. At the moment, we don't pay for the pollution that is caused. We need to price that in. And we need to get serious about regulation. We need fair and enabling regulation. And we need to see businesses stop lobbying for regulation that undermines sustainable outcomes. And we also need to shift from shareholder primacy to a model of stakeholder capitalism. But probably the most important thing that needs to change is our mindset. And those of you that are systems practitioners, you'll have read the work from Donella Meadows, and she talks about the deepest lever for systems change being our mindset, our values, the stories we tell ourselves, our beliefs. And I've learned this the hard way. I've co-created really ambitious sustainability strategies for many organizations, and then just wondered why nothing happened. And it's because at the board level, the mindset just wasn't there to embrace the innovation, the creativity, the ambition that was inherent in that strategy. And so within the Business Transformation Compass, we set out these different mindsets. They're nested from being less harmful to doing no harm, repair and replenishing, which is that net positive mindset, to the just and regenerative mindset. And what we talk about are critical shifts. So if you can really adopt a just and regenerative mindset, so see potential everywhere, understand your role in creating systems change, then no matter where you are on your sustainability journey, you'll make faster and more rapid progress. And so what we've done in the business transformation is shown what happened when you look at issue areas from carbon to biodiversity to governance to human rights, and then corporate functional areas from procurement to marketing. What happens if you shift your mindset? You start to see an acceleration through that maturity model. And so this is the just and regenerative mindset, deep understanding of the system in which you operate. You can't have a sustainable business in an unsustainable system. It just doesn't work like that. Really focusing on planetary health, but also creating the norms, the structures that make things fairer, building equality into how we go about making decisions, and recognizing participatory and authentic democracy procedures. So the one thing I'd love you to take away from today is that the closer we get to a just and regenerative mindset, the closer we'll get to a just and regenerative future. And it does start with us and the way we see the world, the stories we tell ourselves. And even if you're at the start of your sustainability journey, adopting this mindset will mean that you will quickly make progress. Thank you for that. I will stop sharing.
Thank you for that presentation, Sally. Really, really illuminating and really incredible work. First question for you. What happens when a business adopts a just and regenerative business mindset? Can you take us inside the boardroom of a typical for-profit company and illustrate what they would do differently if they had a J&R mindset?
I can. And obviously the business transformation have got pages and pages on this, but I'll choose two examples, if I may. I'll take an issue and I'll take a corporate function. So take climate. With that, do no harm mindset, you'll be saying to yourself, I need to reduce my carbon emissions. I need to have some kind of net zero carbon strategy. With a do no harm mindset, you'll probably set emission reduction targets that are in line with the original thinking around Paris Agreement, which actually is saying we need to be net zero by 2050. The current science, all of the findings of the latest IPCC report, that tells it that's too late. But with a just and regenerative mindset, where you recognize the urgency of stabilizing planetary boundaries, that second bullet, then as you set your carbon strategies, you're going to set them in much more ambitious timeframes. So I would love everyone to be setting zero carbon strategies for scope 1, scope 2, so direct emissions, zero carbon by 2030, zero carbon for scope 3 by latest 2040, go for 2039. But that's what happens because your JNR mindset just really helps you understand the urgency of that planetary boundary and the need to reconfigure systems. So that's one shift I've seen happen, and it's astonishing. There's just much more urgency about the approach to climate and biodiversity and so on. But let's take corporate affairs. So with a do no harm mindset, you're probably adopting a defensive investor relation position. So you will be thinking about how can you avoid being having your stock downgraded. You'll be sort of be quite defensive and kind of, not necessarily telling a full and authentic story of all of your impacts, but you'll be just kind of trying to keep investor attention away from you. With a just and regenerative mindset, even if you're at that part in your journey, you'll probably leave lobbying groups that are actively lobbying against sustainable outcomes, because anyone can do that. And I mentioned a moment ago, there's still a lot of advocacy that actually is locking in the current system. And so with a just and regenerative mindset, you'll leave those groups. And just let me give you another example within corporate affairs as well. So if you're at that do-good mindset, so you're managing your negative impacts, you're wanting to repair and replenish the world around you. So you'll be starting to tell positive stories about the positive impact that you're creating as a corporate. With a just and regenerative mindset, you'll go further than telling stories about how you're creating positive impact. You'll probably be setting up new collaborations to work with others to drive systemic change. So you see the difference. And I guess just one final example, going back to climate to really land this point. If you are in that do-good mindset with climate, so you're repairing and you're replenishing, you might be really putting in place top-down initiatives on climate through your supply chain as a way of dealing with scope 3 emissions, pretty good. With a just and regenerative mindset, and this is the difference, you'll be investing in the capacity of your supply chain to actually do it for themselves, and for the supply chain to reconfigure so that the supply chain is capable of got thriving and flourishing into one word there, thriving and flourishing into the long term. So just that mindset shift, it alters what you do.
Absolutely. And you mentioned during your presentation, you talked about shareholder primacy. So many big businesses operate on a quarterly reporting model, which is geared more toward shareholders than stakeholders. But the JNR model is more about catering to stakeholders, citizens like us, who are negatively impacted by the decisions, often neglectful decisions of big companies. Can you tell us about the difference between those philosophies, the shareholder and stakeholder philosophies, and why counterintuitively the stakeholder model might be better for business? In other words, businesses that adopt a JNR mindset can be more profitable while also benefiting society.
Yeah, great question. And part of the answer comes from understanding how pathways to value creation are shifting. So historically, pathways to value creation for a listed company, be they listed on Wall Street or the London Stock Exchange, has been your quarterly returns, has been your profits bottom line. And that's how the economy has been running. And it's been working for a few, not so well for the many, and certainly not very well for the planet. And if we look out to the future, and if we think about ourselves heading into a net zero world, we think about ourselves heading into a world where citizens find their voice, and they're already doing this, a world where purpose-driven brands are rewarded for doing the right things, then pathways to value creation change. And so actually, a stakeholder model of capitalism is a way of future-proofing your business, because it's allowing you to think about, how do I create economic value by being part of the solution? There's going to be no room in the world, by even as short term as 2030, for organizations that are still emitting tons of carbon, that are undermining structural cohesion amongst communities, and that haven't really grappled with the enormity of the challenges that we face. Because actually by 2030, no one's going to invest in you as a business. You're going to be heavily regulated, and you'll probably be out of business. So that proactive understanding of how pathways to value creation change, and that your value as a business will be determined by how well you steward the environment, how well you build social equity and drive diversity and inclusion, then that stakeholder capitalism model is a bit of a no-brainer.
Absolutely. And to amplify your point, I would say our planet's resources are finite, and yet most capitalist business models are based on unlimited growth. It doesn't actually make sense, does it?
No, and I think, I mean, there's been so many books written on redefining growth. I think it's actually happening now. And so we understand the limitations of GDP as a measure of any kind of progress. I mean, it's just really not a good measure at all. And we're understanding that a really narrow focus on short-term profit maximization, it'd be interesting to see how long that sustains. I give it a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. I think we're in a rapid transition moment.
Terrifying, but true. Let's talk a little bit about inclusive impact itself. The climate emergency is having tremendously negative impact around the planet, but that negative impact is always worse on marginalized communities, women, children, indigenous communities, and impoverished people or nations. How can the inclusive impact help alleviate the suffering in these communities? Yeah,
and that goes straight to the heart of this notion of a just transition. So there's a pathway to net zero, which is a mechanistic, carbon counting driven pathway that, yes, could get us to zero carbon emissions. But unless we pay attention to the social dimension of that transition, it will be what I termed earlier. It will be a very shallow transition, because we won't have shifted the underlying systems. And so that's why we hear so much around the just transition. How do we rapidly decarbonize in a way that's got equity centered within it? And, you know, we're seeing examples of this begin to happen. So here in the UK, as Forum, we have a project in the northeast of the country where a coal-fired power station is closing down. We're one of several partners working with government funding, grant, philanthropic funding, to really create the conditions and create the access to capital for the community to reskill, so that when that power station shuts, the jobs don't go with it. And equally in India, we have a very big project looking at responsible energy, looking at how do you scale renewable energy in a way that drives economic prosperity, centers social equity. And I think that's the key, really, is that we have to look at the transition of the economy through the lens of the multiple systems, and with the, going back to that guiding star of Just Regenerative, respecting the universality of human rights and thinking about fairer and more equal ways of distributing value. And back to the Just Regenerative mindset, it's about recognizing the potential of any situation and creating the conditions where everyone finds their voice. Now, that's really hard to do, because our current systems are not geared to support that. But we are seeing some leading philanthropic organizations, leading businesses getting really serious about ensuring that the transition that we're on is an inclusive one. Simply because if it's not, and it's this shallow transition, we are storing up so many problems for our society, and we run the risk of fracturing our society even more than we are at the moment. And so whilst it's difficult, it's hard. If we don't pay attention to the social dimension of this transition, it will be a shallow transition. it will be a fragile one, and actually any hope of delivering the SDGs will be gone. So it's all about understanding the full set of interconnected systems around you, and that the transition to net zero isn't just a carbon story, it's a livelihood story, it's a social equity story, and designing deep transformation with that systemic understanding in mind.
Perfect transition to my next question, which is that there are food systems, there are health systems, there are education systems. If we can fix these purposeful systems, we have a better shot at creating a sustainable planet. Tell us more about systems, how they work and how they benefit us, and how do you define a system?
Oh, one of my favorite questions.
I'm so glad.
Yeah. So a system is just a configuration of parts with a function. So I'm sitting here in the Tate Modern in the UK. This is this in itself is a system. It's a system designed to use art to inspire. So a system can be a social system. So it could be education. It could be the health system. It could be an ecological system, the ocean, our planet, the air that we breathe. It can be an organization. An organization is a system. It's just simply a configuration of parts pulled together with a specific purpose in mind. Now, the confusing bit is systems change is both a process and an outcome. And that's where you can start to tie yourself in knots. But fundamentally, the approach really recognizes that the world, and Donello Meadows said this really well, we haven't yet solved for our big intractable problems because we treat the world as a set of linear boxes and linear issues, and actually everything is connected. And what happens in one part of the system sends ripples out that then cascade. So a really great example of that intersection of systems is the food system and the climate system. The intersection point there is soil. So if we can restore soil health in the way that we know we need to, not only will we improve nutritional quality of crops, so we've got a positive impact in the food system, we can also improve the ability of soil to act as a carbon sink, positive impact in the climate system. And so systems are configurations of parts. Understanding the connections between systems offers us huge potentials to drive systemic change. Another intersection point is climate and health. Climate change will manifest itself, and it already is, as a public health crisis. Understanding those interconnections allows us to drive change in multiple systems. So simply switching a manufacturing site from oil-fired energy sources, fossil fuel-based sources, to renewables, tick for climate, you suddenly become zero carbon, tick for emissions, and therefore public health, because you're not emitting any more noxious gases into the atmosphere. So a systems approach allows you to understand these interconnections, focus on them, and then you get these cascading impacts that begin to shift the system. So it's way more complicated and messy than kind of, mechanistic linear strategies. But it actually
and yet
offers
regenerative solutions are also win-win-win-win-win solutions.
Totally, because regenerative at its heart is asking, how do we learn from living systems? Because the world is a set of interconnected living systems. So if we can embrace that messiness, embrace that complexity, accept that sometimes we'll get it wrong, think about the switch to biofuels, terrible idea. But it was with positive intent. We need to wean ourselves off oil and gas. So let's just go and grow a load of biofuels. And let's think about, you probably need that land for food. But that's the point about systems thinking. Now, with that understanding, you think, actually, we've got a piece of land here. What's the best use of that land to drive regenerative and just outcomes? It isn't biofuels. It will be food of some sort. So that's what a system is: configuration of parts. Systems thinking allows you to find these nodes, intervention points that drive systemic change. Systems change is where that configuration of parts have shifted to a new goal.
You mentioned the SDGs a few times, and the SDGs are our North Star at Brooklyn Story Lab for sure, but I'm not sure that everyone in the audience knows what the SDGs are. So just a quick background. The SDGs,
sure.
Sustainable Development Goals, are a blueprint unanimously adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2015 to make sure that society was more sustainable and to make sure no one on the planet got left behind. The SDGs themselves seem very systems-based. Each one is its own system, and each one seems connected to the other. And they were drafted as part of a 15-year cycle, the hope being that they would be achieved by 2030. They're also known as the 2030 Agenda. So we are now 7 years into that 15-year cycle, and we are 2 years into what is being called the decade of action, those critical 10 years before we reach 2030, when we, as a planet, will need to have achieved or come close to achieving the SDGs. Are you optimistic, Sally, about where we are on that timeline? And if not, how do we convince others to more urgently adopt this J&R mindset that will help us get there?
Depending on the time of day, I might give you a different answer to that question. The cognitive dissonance that exists in our world today is phenomenal. You could persuade yourself that it's too late. Some of the science would suggest that it might be, and the sheer task ahead of us, we've got to rewire the global economy in 8 years. Really, we have got to do that. So that's the sort of glass half empty. But then I quickly go to, but actually, if you think about the global economy now and think about these big institutional investors coming in, allocating billions of dollars into zero carbon technology, if you think about the scaling of nature-based solutions where we've managed to deploy the kind of instruments of capitalism to work for sustainable development, and then if you think about the activation of societies around the world that are really passionate about a better future, and you think about all these purpose-driven brands, and you think about the innovation that it's on the edge of our system, you think, well, maybe we can. And I think this speaks to this moment in time. We are at a crossroads. We really are. And we knew that at the beginning of 2020, but I don't think I really appreciate how decisive this decade would be. And so we're staring at all of these systems. They are reconfiguring. They might ping back to where they were because there's a lot of inherent energy in a system to go back to how it operates. And we all know this. And there's a great saying, which, this is part of my life. The closer you get to changing a system, the harder it pushes back at you because it's its last kind of attempt to go back to where it was. And that's why, by the way, we're seeing so much volatility at the moment, because we're at the edge of the capacity of these systems to endure. And we're seeing a lot of vested interests wanting to push them back. If I were to be pushed, I think we can do it, but we have to do it now. We can't afford any more greenwashing, any more, sorry, this is such a British phrase, dithering on the part of international, national governments. We need leadership and bold ambition. And we also need to appreciate we all have a role to play. We all have power. We all have agency, every single one of us. And so there is a pathway to 2030 that does stabilize our climate, that does move us towards net zero, that does deal with some of the root causes of structural inequality, structural racism. It's all there to play for. But we've got to get real and do it now.
Thank you for navigating that. And I had another question that was more of a doom and gloom question, but I think I'm going to skip that one because I think I want to put us on an upward trajectory. So you've been doing this kind of work for 25 years. You're an absolute pioneer in this space. What has surprised you over the last 25 years in the regenerative space? And what is giving you hope? I want to lift the mood a little bit.
So I've been surprised by a few things and probably disappointed by many more. But I think, let me answer the question in two ways. The positive things I've seen happen that are worth paying attention to are, first, when I started in this field, sustainability wasn't even a thing. I've got a degree in biology. Environmental science wasn't even a thing you could go and study. And now look, you can study environmental science for as long and as deep as you want to. So sustainability has moved from the edges into the center of education, into the center of business. I wrote my first sustainability policy, 25 years ago. And people went, what is this? This is ridiculous. So sustainability has come from the edges of a system into the mainstream, which is a good thing, but we haven't yet reconfigured the underlying systems. But I think what has surprised me, and this is a good thing, is COVID-19 has been devastating. We all know that. We all have been touched by it. I have lost a friend to COVID. I've lost family members. It's a tragic, tragic story, and we mustn't forget that. However, it has shown us several things. We can innovate really quickly if we want to. Who would have thought it's possible to go from a vaccine in a test tube into people's arms in less than 12 months? So when we want to do something, we can do it. It has shown us how the public sector and the private sector can work together, from the reconfiguring of manufacturing sites, manufacturing lines for PPE, through to retailers in the UK, the US, giving over their car parts for rapid COVID testing. It's shown us how we build community resilience, how we learn to love our local environment. It's shown us we don't need to travel in the way that we used to. Yes, we do need to travel because we're humans and we create change by interacting, which is, I hope that one day I get to meet you in person. But COVID has been a good lesson in how we deal with uncertainty and ambiguity. And so that surprised me. And it surprised me how much of that is sticking. And people are a little bit more open to uncertainty and ambiguity because we're going to need to be. We're in a decade not only of decisiveness, but of discontinuity. These shocks to the system are going to keep coming as systems reconfigure. And it's been a pandemic, there's now a war, there'll be more shock to the system. So our ability to navigate that complexity has suddenly got a lot better over the last couple of years. And we need to keep hold of that. So people talk about new normal. There's no new normal. There is the tantalizing prospect of a just and regenerative future, which won't feel normal and it won't even look normal for a while. But it talks about the possibility of changing things for good. And that's the possibility that is here right now. So lessons coming out of the pandemic, let's keep them and build on them. Let's treat COVID as a dress rehearsal for the climate emergency. Learn, then the next emergency that comes, we'll be able to withstand much, much better. So yeah, I've been surprised by what you can draw from a really difficult moment in time.
And I look forward to meeting you in person as well, by the way. I have one more question for the moment, and then I'm going to open it up to the students who are in the chat. And then I'll have one more question to close, but just wanted to let people know that if you have questions, put them in the chat now. And now back to my question. The Rutgers students on this campus in Newark are very diverse. Many are first-generation students. What can they do? What actions can they take to be aware ambassadors of a J&R mindset?
Yeah, thank you for that question. First of all, Just and Regenerative is about understanding your own voice, your own power, your own agency. And everybody has all of those things. And just feeling that that is yours and you have a voice and it will be heard and it can be heard. So don't ever feel that what you say or do won't matter. It really does. And that's at the heart of systems thinking, in that actions we take as individuals, they might feel inconsequential, but then they'll ladder up into shifts at a community, shifts regionally, and so on and so forth. So unleash your power, your voice, your agency, and then think about the decisions you make every day. What food are you eating? Could you have a more balanced diet in terms of the carbon intensity of your food? Plant-based proteins are now here. I'm a vegetarian. I've been one all of my life, and it was pretty miserable, I can tell you, being a vegetarian without any tofu. But now you can eat a plant-based diet. It's the same cost as a non-plant-based diet. So dietary choices, active travel choices, walking, cycling, all much better than alternatives, public transport. And then book your parents. So if your parents have got a pension or parents have got savings, ask them, where is that pension? Where are those savings? If you're lucky enough to have either of those two things, many people in the US are, because what tends to happen is that pension funds will then go and invest your money, usually in what's called sovereign wealth funds. and big ones now are in Russia. So where are your parents' pensions? Ask them. And if they don't know, get them to find out. And if they are backing sovereign wealth funds in regimes you don't agree with, just use your pestering power and get them to shift their pensions, because that will send a really important signal to the financial institutions. So there's a whole campaign here in the UK called Know Where Your Money Is. And honestly, it's probably the most important thing that people could do right now. But finally, remember, this sounds very grand, but the future isn't written, right? So everything we do today, the decisions we make, the actions we take, will determine what happens tomorrow. So at this moment in time, this, perilous and potentially transformational moment in time, it could go either way. There are multiple futures available to us. So keep that within you and know that every decision you make, every dollar you spend will make a difference. So who and what is receiving your dollar? How can you make choices about what you do? And how can you use the compass of a just and regenerative future to determine how everything you do today can make a difference? Because we can create the future that we want. The future doesn't just happen to us. So embrace that just and regenerative North Star in everything you do. The chances are we send a much better, will mean we have a much better chance to create the future that we want, rather than one that just happens to us.
Fantastic. No, that's wonderful advice to the student audience here. I'm going to ask the first question here. Read the first question from one of the students. This is from Mirat Dave. The vast majority of corporations have and continue to focus on their own ESG footprint and actions. Should we be considering adding to that scope the notion of enabling the masses of people beyond the walls of the corporation to take action?
Sorry, could you read? Is that in the chat? Sorry.
Yes, it is. It's from Mirat Dave. Should we be considering adding to that scope the notion of enabling the masses of people beyond the walls of corporation to take action?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, the line just cut for a minute there, so I didn't quite get the full question. The reality is, to drive systemic change, you need all actors in the system to point in a different direction. So yes, there's a role for the private sector. Yes, there's a role for government, but there's a critical role for society. And also critically, legislation is needed, but legislators are reluctant to pull that lever depending on where societal norms are. So we absolutely need civil society to find its voice. It is as important as business, as important as government. And what we need are all those different actors to come together and to align around a different set of goals. So when you hear people power, it's real. It's completely real.
Excellent. Here's one from Sarah Kaplan. Those 1% who hold 2/3 of the wealth are going to be very resistant to change because they stand to lose. What can we do to get those in privilege to contribute fairly to society? Parentheses, example, even paying taxes.
It's a brilliant question. And it's got a lot of truth to it. I talked earlier about the closer you get to shifting a system, the more the harder it pushes back. That is vested interest. That is people for whom, yeah, no, thank you. Actually, I'm fine as I am. So then you need to think about what are the influences on those individuals potentially. And this is again, sorry, someone's just come into my little box room. This is again where you need to, and I use this tactic quite a lot. If you think about
being disrupted at the tape,
my system is suffering perturbations around me. Sorry, I am literally in a box room just off the main turbine hall at the Tate Modern. There will be individuals very resistant to change because it will seem that they will have to give things up. How do you influence them? So we do often on work for family business networks in Forum, and there's a younger generation of family business folk for whom this agenda really does count. And actually, they can be really powerful at speaking to the current generation in power and getting them to see things differently. Because going back to that shift that you see in Just and Regenerative, one of the shifts that needs to happen is from a sort of narrow, static view of win, lose, win, lose. That's where a lot of these people are, to a much fuller view of potential where everyone can win. And so shifting the narrative from you're not losing, you're actually investing in a sustainable future for your children, for your grandchildren. Often getting people to sort of position themselves in the future that they want can be the biggest unlock that you can see. So there'll always be a segment of society who will, whenever they see me run a mile, won't want to listen to me, and that's okay. But I think there's an increasing segment that understand where we're at, and that this isn't about them losing anything. This is about them gaining everything. And going back to intergenerational equity, nobody wants to leave a fragile, brittle world to their grandchildren. Nobody wants to do that. So how do you work with those in power, get them to see the future, understand what it might look like, locate themselves in that future, and then ask, what are they going to do differently today to make sure that future isn't the one that's handed off to their grandchildren? So broadening horizons becomes really critical. And then ultimately, I think what also will happen is we will see firm regulation on taxes, to pick up that point at the moment. At the moment, it's way too easy to not pay your share. But this is where I think, going back to the previous comment, people power will be really interesting. There's nowhere to hide anymore. And so all these kind of complex tax dodging schemes, of which there are very many, as people find out about them, they're going to shout about them, and will put incredible pressure on some of the best known brands we know in the world. So let's see what happens when that happens, that becomes a reality. And I think you'll see legislation shifting, certainly in Europe and in the UK, probably in parts of the world like Singapore. It will become harder and harder to avoid those loopholes. So my dream is that it isn't 1% holding 2/3 of the world's wealth by 2030. We've got a much fairer distribution of wealth, and that yes, you'll still have this tiny cohort of resistors. You'll have resistance in any system, but we'll have unlocked the activating forces of civil society, of forward-thinking, purposeful driven brands, of investors that have got an eye on the long game. Will have activated all of these forces, and they will have meant that the system has shifted.
So brilliant what you just said, and just to piggyback on what you said, when you apply a J&R mindset, a just and regenerative mindset to, I don't want to pick on a company, but say Amazon, that is not paying taxes, and those taxes that would go to building and paving roads that Amazon uses, it's only in their best interest to get to for a just regenerative future, to make their own businesses more to run more smoothly and to be more accessible to the public that they're serving.
Yeah, and that goes back to that systems view, doesn't it? Because at the moment, I would imagine that many people, in Amazon and other businesses, it doesn't occur to them, how is that road maintained? Who maintains that road? And the fundamental link between the quality of that road and their ability to get goods to market, because they'll be thinking about logistics here, they'll be thinking about community here, and it will all be separate and completely one-dimensional in terms of how we view these things. But as soon as you start to understand as a business that you are part of a bigger system, and that the health of your business relies on the health of that system, then actually you begin to understand, if there's a big hole in that road, then my logistics model is going to, I make money on how fast I get stuff to market and how fast I get things to end consumers. If there aren't any roads, how am I going to do that? And so you start to understand the indivisibility and interconnectedness of the success of your organization and the success of the system around it. And I just wish that more businesses saw that. But you don't get taught this stuff as you come out of colleges with an MBA. Oh, sorry, there's now a disco happening. So I'll go on mute while I'm not talking.
You got in for free without having to pay the extra charge for the disco. While we're waiting, I'm going to ask another question, but please, people in the audience, please feel free to populate more questions into the chat. But in the meantime, Sally, who's doing it right? Who do you admire, whether an individual business leader or a company that you can point to as an example and say, this is the way to do it?
I'm really sorry about the background noise. I hope it's not too disturbing.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Oh, it stopped. I really admire Unilever. They are one of the first organizations to get really serious about sustainability. I know they're having a tough time right now because of the Ferrari about whether or not they were buying GSK consumer healthcare, but they have deeply and authentically integrated sustainability into many of their brands, and they're using their brands to solve some of our biggest societal issues, from self-esteem in young girls through to health and sanitation in developing parts of the world. So I love Unilever, absolutely, thank you. I love Patagonia. I love what they did nearly a decade ago. Don't buy me, reuse me, recycle me. There are many brands in the US that I really do admire. I do a lot of work with Target, or Target, as I know it's fondly referred to in the States. They've just published a really ambitious strategy called Target Forward. We work with them on it. And it's understanding how, as a mass retailer, can they play a role in delivering an equitable and regenerative future? They've got the word regenerative in for a mainstream retailer. You've got to admire that in its terms of its boldness and its ambition. So there are many, many organizations to admire. And I love another one from a different sector. I love what Google is doing in terms of deployment of its tech. So Google and others are using their technology to really pinpoint where aspects such as illegal deforestation is happening in real time. So using their tech for good. And there's all sorts of, yeah, absolutely, Eileen Fisher, Adidas. And I think that's the beauty of where we are. There are so many examples. Our challenge is that it doesn't add up yet to wholesale systemic change. And we haven't yet properly challenged the current economic model. And that's what needs to come next.
That's fantastic. You mentioned Unilever. The former CEO of Unilever, Paul Polman,
Yes.
wrote a book called Net Positive, just for the audience to know. And
Yes.
the co-author of that book, Andrew Winston, will be appearing on this stage in very soon today.
Yes, he's on my board of trustees with Noah.
Excellent. Okay.
So I think it's about page 65. You'll see some quotes from someone called Sally Uren in that book as well.
I did see that. I did read the book. And also Paul Polman is a member of the B team. And next up after us in this in our conversation is Hala Thomasdottir, who's the CEO of the B team, interviewing Joseph Kenner, another member of the B team, who has a fabulous corporation called Greyston Bakeries, which
Yes,
which addresses employment issues, which they'll talk about.
they do a wonderful job.
So while there were a couple of comments that weren't really questions that I thought I would just point out, and Dan, the wonderful Dan Baina mentioned, the compass is truly a pivotal work, Sally. Excellent, agreed. Mindset to many sounds like fluff, but it is the primary foundation for genuine change.
Thank you, Dan. Glad you were able to join us.
And let's see, Linda Morris Kelly says, every choice is a next first step, one that opens some doorways and closes others. Awareness is important and significant.
I agree.
All right, I'm gonna go to another one of my questions here. Today's event is focused on inclusivity, and there are so many who don't have a seat at the table. There are, in fact, at least 2 billion people who don't have access to the digital economy. When dealing with these kinds of numbers, how can we make significant inroads more quickly?
We need to get a bit creative, and we need to think more expansively. And let me give you an example. So one of our projects in the US is called Growing Our Future.
And I apologize, Sal. Please answer the question, but we are coming up on time. Just,
okay, so we've got a big project in ag in the US, and we have really tried to create a space to enable the participation of marginalized farming communities, historically disadvantaged farming communities. And we've done that by actually accessing another grant that we're then re-granting to allow their participation. So really get serious about enabling the participation of groups that historically have been put out of these conversations, and use philanthropy in particular to enable that activation.
Wonderful. Moderator Noah, are we good on time? Are we should we wrap things up?
The next session is starting in 2 minutes, so I suggest, this was an amazing conversation. Thank you both. Sally, I appreciate your flexibility taking this from the back room at the Tate. I know that it's a venue with a lot of echoing rooms, so I appreciate your ability to join us. And Lance, thank you so much for moderating this great conversation. Everyone in the room, as Lance mentioned, we have a fantastic panel coming up next with Hala here, who is the former presidential candidate of Iceland and CEO of Richard Branson's B Team. That will be in conversation with Joseph Kenner, the CEO of Grayston Bakery, which is a pioneer in open hiring practices. And that session will be moderated by one of our students, Santuana Mandalika. So hope that you're all able to shift gears quickly and join us for the next session. And just once again, really want to echo my thanks to Sally and Lance.
Thank you.
Thank you
Been a
all.
great conversation.
What a wonderful audience, and Noah, thank you, and Rutgers so much for putting this together.
Yeah, thank you. Lovely to see you, Noah.
And Sally, so great to meet you.
Yeah, likewise. Hopefully in person soon.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you both. Take care. Bye.